All right, for more on this, I'm joined by Anthony Chen, Chief Economist with Chase. Anthony, always a pleasure.
Glad to be here.
Glad to have you. So, Anthony, the #1 biggest economy in the world, the US, the #3 biggest economy in the world, Japan, saying they're not joining the AIIB.
I think that's the answer for now. I think that anytime a country has to make one of these decisions, they have to balance political and economic considerations. I think clearly by the large number of members that are founding members,
57.
a lot of them have chosen their economic interests ahead of the political considerations. But I think over time, when there's more transparency and people realize what this bank is about, I think things will calm down.
You think the US and Japan will get on board?
I think we'll see more members. I think it's too early to speculate on whether it's Japan or the United States, since those two countries have been holdouts, but I think you'll see more countries.
But what
and
impact?
Eventually you might see a surprise.
Does it have a big impact that the #1 and #3 biggest economies in the world are not taking part? Does this...
I think symbolic, it has some sort of an impact, but I think that if you give it some time, things will thaw out a little bit and more countries will join, and eventually it will be a non-event.
Well, one of the big concerns is what is the structure of this bank going to look like? Some say that it could be by GDP size, in which case China will, of course, be the #1. There are 57 members that have signed up. In the past, China has said that 75% of the shares will be allocated to Asian members, 25% will be allocated to non-Asian members. Beyond that, do we have any kind of indication of what the structure is going to look like?
No, I think that so far it's a bit of a mystery, but I think you got to ask the question, what is the purpose of this bank? The purpose of this bank is to improve the infrastructure, which is going to benefit the global economy. This is not a sort of a sinister goal. This is actually a good goal, and it's going to help the global economy, which includes the United States, includes Japan, and includes the 57 countries. So this is actually not a bad thing.
No one's saying it's a bad thing. It's quite saucy to say that it has negative implications. But there is concern that China will have veto power and will use the bank as a way of influencing major geopolitical events. What do you say to that?
Well, again, you have to look at how much money we're talking about. We're talking about a bank that has the potential of having $100 billion of potential money to build out infrastructure. But the numbers suggest that by the year 2020, Asia is going to need up to $8 trillion of infrastructure expenditure. So still, I don't want to say this, but it's still relatively small figures relative to what you need.
All right, well, let's talk about this veto power. Some speculation that China will have it. What do you say to that?
Well, I would say that in the IMF, the United States has veto power, and I think things are working very well. So maybe this is a way of balancing things out. Keep in mind that China is now the second largest economy in the world. And if you look at China on a purchasing power parity basis, some estimates suggest China is already equal to the United States.
Well, the US and Japan have raised concerns about governance. Do you think they're valid?
Well, I think that because there's still not a lot of information, governance issues, environmental, labor issues, and the whole structure is still uncertain. And those are issues that the United States and Japan have raised. As you know, Japan at one point was flirting with the possibility of joining until they backed off.
They were indeed. What about the people that are going to be running the show? So far, the president and the vice president have not been chosen. Most likely that Jean-Lee Quinn, who heads the Secretariat, will lead the bank. Do you think that the first president should be Chinese?
Well, I think so. They came up with the idea. It's only fair to make it. I mean, nobody complains about the fact that of all the power the United States has in some of the world organizations. And I think it was just a matter of time before the Chinese would have to pick something in which they took a leadership role.
You know, we're talking a lot about the AIIB, but what about the new development bank of the BRIC countries, which is also headquartered in China? Why is that flying under the radar?
I think all these developments, and one of the things, since you mentioned the Asian Development Bank and the others, one of the goals of the Asian Development Bank is to work together with all the multi-global organizations, which includes the other organization you mentioned, but it also includes the IMF, also includes the World Bank. They're not going to be working in opposition. They're going to be working together to complement and supplement the efforts.
So you see them all working together then?
That is I was looking at the preamble, or in fact the goal of the Asian Investment Bank, and that's what it says, and I have to take them at their word until they prove otherwise.
All right. Well, Anthony, you've been telling us for a long time that we're going to see a correction in the Chinese mainland market. Seems you're on the money with that one. Chinese stocks diving. The Shanghai Composite down 7.4% just today.
Yes, and in fact,
what is going on?
From the peak, it's down a little over 19%. So when you look at these figures, you basically say it's a correction is something that's normal.
This is the correction you've been calling for.
Well, it's not at all unusual. In the United States, we've had 14 bull markets since the 1940s, and the average number of corrections per bull market is 1.6. And by the way, Chinese equities are still relatively cheap. When you look at the A shares, market cap relative to GDP, we're talking about a number somewhat below 90%. At the previous peak, it was up to 120%. And then you have to also take into account who's benefiting from the rise in the equity market. A lot of the state-owned enterprise. That's one of the reasons why the government is so anxious. And by the way, we also know that the fundamentals are gradually stabilizing. So all these factors are fairly bullish over a long period of time. So you're not
worried that it was down 14% for the month?
I am not. When you see
you think the rally is going to continue?
I think the rally is going to continue because it's in the best interest of the government, and I also believe that policymakers are going to encourage it. When you look at the latest market survey that showed an improvement, but still fairly weak, but the weak link of that index was employment. And guess what? That's a very crucial metric for the Chinese government. If employment is weak, they're going to do a lot more stimulus. And a lot more stimulus everywhere, whether it's Japan, the United States, or Europe, has meant what? Higher equity prices, always.
And you think this is going to translate across the board, even with the weaker economic fundamentals that we're seeing?
But exactly those weak economic fundamentals is what are leading to more policy. So
it's going to be a stimulus-fueled rally will continue.
That is exactly. Look at the United States. We've had one of the weakest recoveries in the post-war period, and yet equity prices have tripled.
Right. All right. We know we will have you back to see where things stand. Thank you so much.